Welcome everyone to the Canadian Nurses Association webinar series, Progress in Practice. This webinar, Optimizing Teamwork Using Conflict Resolution Strategies, is being recorded for nurses who are unable to participate today. My name is Josette Poussel. I'm the Program Lead in Nursing Practice and Policy at the Canadian Nurses Association, and I will be hosting this webinar. At the end of the webinar, you will be able to answer your questions, which you can type in the Q&A box at the right side of the slide. We will address as many questions as time allows. And now a little bit about our presenter, Isabelle St-Pierre. Isabelle is an associate professor in the Department of Nursing at the Université du Québec en Outaouais. Her research interests include workplace violence and conflict resolution. She is a certified conflict coach. She holds a PhD and master's degrees in nursing, a diploma at the master's level in adult education, and a certificate in occupational health. She has guest lectured about and written several articles and book chapters on workplace violence. Over to you, Isabelle.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. It's my pleasure to talk with you about how to optimize teamwork using conflict resolution strategies. The objectives for today's presentation are to explore how values and needs underpin behaviors, examine the role of emotion when interacting with others, become aware of internal scenarios emerging when feeling triggered, and reflect on new ways to deal with difficult relationships. I would like to start this webinar by talking about dysfunctional relationships because they are often what undermines teamwork. What is a dysfunctional relationship? It is said to be non-teamwork promoting behaviors that can be defined as behaviors that impact the healthcare team's ability to achieve intended outcomes. These can be manifested by bullying, verbal, electronic, and physical abuse. Electronic is a new form of abuse that's been coming out more and more recently. They include emails, social media, and other form of abuse on social media, including Facebook and Twitter. So having derogatory comments made electronically. It can also include yelling, degrading comments and insults, refusing to work together, workplace conflict, disrespectful interactions, condescending remarks, berating in front of staff, and abusive language. What can contribute to these dysfunctional behaviors? In the hospital, we see that there's a lot of hierarchical structures, pressure to keep patients moving through the system, healthcare professionals' personality characteristics, and socialization during the professional education. Role differences is another one that I've seen emerging a lot more recently, and it can lead to role confusion, scope of practice being not well defined or utilized. And with new roles, new emerging roles like paraprofessionals, sometimes there is role confusion, and this can lead to dysfunctional relationships. And there's also the constant change in team members, whereas if you work on a 9-to-5 Monday to Friday job, you're always working with the same people. And when you work in the hospital setting, you're often working with people you don't necessarily know well. So it's easier to attribute negative intention when you don't know the people. Other contributing factor, this comes from a study, a 2011 study, and it was a study of 20 emergency room departments in the U.S. And what it showed was that poor attitude and disruptive personality accounted for 61.5% of the factors contributing to dysfunctional behaviors at work. Time delay, so having to wait for people or having to wait for procedure, accounted for 57% of dysfunctional behaviors, and inadequate staffing, 40%, poor communication skills, 40%, Inappropriate tools or equipment, 31.4%. Unclear roles and responsibilities, 29%. The throughput delays is the rate at which you get the information. So it's a lot to do with communication delays, and scheduling issues, 15%. The consequences of dysfunctional relationship at work. There's a link that has been done between disruptive behaviors and adverse clinical outcomes. And this link and those statistics are as perceived by the survey respondent of this 2011 study. So we've seen that disruptive behavior will affect nursing satisfaction, physician satisfaction, and that's satisfaction at work, and patient satisfaction with the service they are getting from the staff. There's also decreased quality of care, an increase in medication error and medical error, an increase in adverse events, and a decrease in patient safety. Other consequences of dysfunctional relationship at work. This study, it's a 2013 study by Rawson et al., and it found that physician disruptive behavior was found to result in nursing staff turnover. And if I may open a little parenthesis about that, on another study on nurse-physician relationship, the authors had found that every time a nurse left the hospital, the cost of the employer for the turnover was 1.5 to 2 times the salary paid for that nurse. So if an RN was making, let's say, $85,000 per year, so the cost could be around $130,000 to $170,000 to the hospital. And that study found that about 2.4 nurses left the hospital annually because of disruptive behaviors from physicians. There's also medication error. 7% were attributed to physician disruptive behavior. Preventable procedural error was also another consequence of dysfunctional relationship from the physician. So when combining the cost of the staff turnover, the medication error, and the procedural error, it was said that hospital could potentially save $1 million per year by addressing those behaviors. So the next phase of this talk would be how we can use conflict resolution strategies to improve dysfunctional relationships at work. So I would like to start by a little quote by Charles Swindoll, who said that life is 10% of what happens to me and 90% on how I react to it. And what I'd like you to get out of this is that just to remember that even though you cannot change what happens to you, you have the ability and the power to choose how you will respond to this situation. In order to do so, it's important that you know about yourself, that you're aware, and that you know how, that you're aware of your triggers, and that you know how you present yourself to the others and how you express yourself to the outside world. So in terms of triggers, what do we mean by triggers? Triggers and when you feel your values, your needs, or aspects of your identity are challenged. So in terms of values, values are your core beliefs or principles. They're what guides you. In terms of needs, they're the requirements that provide you with a sense of security and self-worth. And your identity is how you see yourself and you want the others to see you. In terms of value, it's important to know that your values usually it's because of your values that you will feel triggers when you feel your values are not understood or met. Your values will be usually specific to you, and they will be influenced by your upbringing, education, your culture. Sometimes if I was to say, what are your values, people don't always know how to say their values. So there's questions you can ask yourself to identify your values. Some of the questions are, what have you been the most proud of during your life? When are you the happiest? What are you doing? What makes you really angry? If I was to ask someone one word to describe you, what would it be? If you were to have things taken away from you, what would you miss the most? And when you don't work, what do you spend your time on? So by asking yourself these questions, they will help you identify your values. So values, I've put a few, but if you go on the internet and Google it, there's a lot of good websites with long list of values. In terms of needs, there's some work been done about human identity needs, and they group them under 5 distinct categories. So meaning is basically why you get up in the morning, the meaning of your life, what motivates you. Meaning is also the way you perceive reality and that you'll interpret facts. The connectedness is very important. It's about social bonding. It includes the customs, the traditions that are shared by the group you're part of. Security is what you need to be feeling safe. So it's often linked to self-identity. Emotional security will be linked to, again, your connectedness, so the social bonds you have with others. In terms of actions, they say that to be meaningful, the actions have to be a matter of choice. So if you have choice to do something, that means you have some control over your environment and some autonomy. You have to remember that some actions are more conscious than others, and that sometimes the norms and standards are tools that will help you in terms of feeling a sense of control if the rules are clear. So policies, procedure, if you're aware of that, it might help you. In terms of recognition, it is how you value your own worth, so self-recognition, and what motivates you. So once you know your values, it's easier to express. Let's say you feel triggered. It's easier to know what could be the reason why you're triggered. The next step is to talk a little bit about emotion. So usually when we're triggered, there's an emotion that arises inside of us. And that emotion, you have to remember that it is only there to tell you that something is happening. So there's no real good or bad emotion. It's how we act once we have the emotion that can be good or bad. So remember that, again, everyone will experience emotion. The difference is how they will show their emotions, the intensity, and what they choose to express. Emotions are directly linked with expectations. So the higher the expectations, when the reality does not match the expectation, the greater the disappointment. And when we're disappointed, we can express it in different ways. It can be sadness, it can be anger, it can be criticism. So again, in the work environment, it could be that the expectations are quite high. You have to remember, again, that emotions, you cannot see the emotions. You can just see how they come out in the body. So the way if we experience an emotion, the way we feel it in the body and we decide, okay, I'm feeling sadness or I'm feeling fear, is a form of translation. So I would say in conflict resolutions, what we face is look how you feel the emotion. Where do you feel it in your body? So is it in your throat? Is it at the pit of your stomach? Are you turning red? Are you sweating? Usually when you feel in your body these things, you know that something is not right. And when you know that something is not right, this is when you can decide to take a deep breath and have a little bit of distance so that you can act versus react with the emotions. Some people say, well, you have to learn to control your emotions. I would argue that it can be really difficult to control your emotion. I would invite you to say that you're going to learn to navigate the emotions instead. So one way to do that, again, is, as I said, to try to step back. So if you feel that you've got this knot in your stomach or that you're starting to sweat, try to understand what is happening, what is being triggered. And if you can, try to distance yourself, as I said, by breathing, counting to 10, asking people to say, can we take a little break here? I need time to reflect. And the idea is to try to embrace the emotion, know something is happening, and then try to decide, make a conscious decision on how you're going to respond versus doing a Homer Simpson and saying something and then you might regret. And in certain books, we call that the amygdala hijack. So when your lower brain is being hijacked by the emotion, you're going to react to a very primitive level. So about emotions, what I'd like you to remember is that it will give you information on what's happening, and it will also get you ready for action. If we want to link the emotions back to the identity needs that we saw earlier, when you feel that your life or your work doesn't have meaning, you often will feel anger. When you feel that you're not connected to your people, you don't have that sense of belonging, you will often experience sadness. When your security is triggered, you will often experience fear. When you don't feel recognized for your work, shame is an emotion that will often come up. And if you feel that you cannot act, it's often depression that you will feel. So once we know, okay, I'm triggered, I know why, this value has been, if you want, not respected, and then I feel the emotion, it's in the pit of my stomach or I'm turning red, then the next step when you're taking that step back is to say, what conclusion am I drawing? What assumption am I making? And sometimes when we make assumptions, it's because we take our scheme of reference. So let's say if I ignore this person, it's because I'm mad at her. So if this person ignore me, then it must be that I'm mad, she is mad at me. And those are the conclusions that we are quickly drawing, but it might not be the case. So I would say that it's important to go and verify the assumptions. In the book Thinking Fast and Slow, they talk about system 1, when it's a system that, again, is very quick, it's involuntary, it's mechanical, and that system is the one that reads the emotion and will draw the quick conclusion. If we can kick to the system 2, or the slower system, the measured system, it will require that you think about what's happening, and this can lead to you interpreting the situation very differently. So again, some of the questions you might want to ask yourself if you're making an assumption is, why would the person do that? Why would Josette ignore me? What would trigger her to do that? What would be her motive? So by asking these questions, again, it will help you say, well, is she really mad at me? Would she really intentionally want to hurt me or discredit me? And often we can realize that it might not be the first of her. I've just lost. And what it means is when you go through that process, what are my triggers? What are my emotions? What are my underlying assumptions? The next step is to go through this and ask yourself to put yourself in the shoes of the other person. So what would the other person be their triggers? What would their assumptions be? What would their emotion be? So questions you can ask yourself is, if the other person was to tell me the story of just what happened, what would the story look like? So it's to have the stories from your perspective, but then the other person, would she see it the same way? What is it that I did that might trigger the other person is important. What emotion might she experience after I triggered her? And what assumption would she make about me? So those are the questions that is important if you have the opportunity to try to put yourself in the other's shoe. And sometimes it helps us reframe or see the story differently. How can I do things differently? There's the question that you, in a book by Adam, she's talking about being a learner versus a judger. And there's a choice map that's available on the internet. I can't show you now because I've lost my internet connection, but if you were to go on the internet and type choice map, you'll see if you want to be a learner and a judger. And basically when you're in the judger mindset, you're often feeling very sorry for yourself or the situation. So you'll make assumptions such as, why are people so lazy? Why is it always happening to me? Why are things so bad? So you're judging the situation. And what Adams has challenged us to do is to change to a learner mindset. So to say, well, what really happened? What assumptions am I making? What are the facts that support that? And by what can I learn from this? And by moving from a judger to a learner, this is where you can shift from being blame-focused to being solution-focused. We can go to the next slide. Sometimes when we are having dysfunctional workplace relationship, it's important to decide if we want to discuss this with the person. And having difficult conversation, there's lots of books on that, but what Stone and company had said was that it's really three conversations that you're having. You're having the what happened conversation. So what happened is about often assigning blame, fault, asserting dominance, and it leads to struggle and bad feeling. So the what happened is often, I'm right, you're wrong, and you're trying to figure out how to make your point, the fact that you're right, be seen. So when you're assigning intention, it's remember that in the what happened conversation, it's your perception. And it's important to try to discuss with the other one to have their perception too. The feeling conversation is trying to stay rational when you're feeling emotion. And often you feel vulnerable when you feel these emotions. So I would challenge to say that it's important to mention the emotion when you're talking about the feeling conversation at the risk of being a little bit vulnerable. But it's also important to talk about the emotion, because if we just stay in the facts, sometimes we stay at a level and we won't resolve the true issue. And the last conversation is about identity. And identity is internal to each person. So this conversation is about what I'm saying to myself about me. So remember that difficult conversation, sometimes it's all about us. And what I'm inviting you to do is to try to see the other's perspective to help you figure it out. We can change to the next slide. So all this requires the art of listening. And when we are upset, we often, while the other person is talking, we often rehearse what we're going to answer to them in our mind. So we're not actually really listening to them. We're trying to prepare our response. So the art of listening, active listening, means that you might ask yourself questions while the other person is talking. So by some questions, you can ask yourself, what am I understanding of this situation? What is most important to me? Why is that important? What is the outcome looking like? What is happening now? And what would I like it to happen to resolve the situation? So if you ask the other person questions while they're talking to you, and the other person realize that you're asking questions to try to understand the situation and not to prove that they're wrong and you're right or to assign blame, often they will be a lot more willing to answer your question, and they might even listen to you a little more. We can change the slide. So in terms of expressing a need, if we put together everything we've talked about so far, when we feel that we are triggered, we can express our situation in a way that we're going to say what is triggering us, what emotion is arising out of us, why, and what you want to do. So for example, if I was to say, when you undermine me in front of everyone, so undermine me would be the triggering event, I feel angry and hurt. That would be my emotion, because my reputation is really important to me. So the reputation is my need to preserve my reputation. And the actionable could look like, would you be willing to talk to me in private the next time you want to give me feedback on my work? So that's very clear and it's very doable. So that's the idea of trying to express a need in a constructive manner so that the others see that it's a need and don't see it as an attack. We can change the slide. So how could you reframe? And this is just to practice, so I realize in a webinar it's a little harder. But if you hear something like, I don't even try to bring out things up anymore because you're incapable of accepting feedback. So when we hear things like that, criticizing our peers, often we feel attacked, and the way we'll respond will be on the defensive. So what I'm inviting you to do here is to try to decode the message that's hidden in there. So if we were to reframe this, we could say something like, when I have feedback to give you about your work, what would be the best way for me to offer it to you? Because the idea was about giving you feedback. The next example, sorry, I guess the power was off. That's why I lost connection, and now it's come back. So if you're hearing all sorts of noise, that's the power coming back. The next point would be, oh my God, I can't believe you dropped the ball again, you idiot. What the hell is wrong with you? I don't know how you ever got hired for this job. So again, in the workplace, we hear a lot of that. It's being attacked by our colleagues when things go wrong. So again, how can we reframe that? We could say something like, I can't believe this, which would be the oh my God. I'm furious that you didn't follow through as you said you would. So instead of calling name, you're saying what they did wrong. I worked really hard to establish trust with this patient, and now it might be jeopardized. So you're saying what's happening, and you can ask them what's going on, what's happening, how can I help you? We can change this slide. In terms of reframing a patient complaint, this is something we can, it's probably something you've heard before when the patient's saying it's the worst hospital staff I've ever encountered, no one will talk to me, when they do they're rude, they're unhelpful, and it's pointless to ask anything because I never get answers. So patients like that patient who are trying to express a need, what I'm suggesting is by thinking of triggers and emotions and assumptions that they might be making. If we're able to not feel attacked and take a step back, we can decode their message. So what they're telling you really is that they're angry about how they've been treated, and they're frustrated by the lack of communication with the staff, and they're probably also worried about their condition. So that's the underlying emotion. And that you as the healthcare professional, the nurse, what you might want to say is identify who the patient can talk to get the answers. So is it you? Is it the physician? Is it another healthcare professional? So by trying to not feel attacked and decode the message and validate with the person that this is what's happening, there might be a different outcome. So to wrap this webinar, you can go to the next slide, the one in the nutshell, and then the one after. What I'm suggesting that we do faced with a difficult relationship at work is to understand our triggers and to decide why. Why is this a trigger? And then the trigger will bring an emotion. So with your emotions, trying to see where do you feel it in your body, because often you start by feeling it in your body before it actually goes up to your mind and you say something you might regret. So really being able to know, okay, if I feel that I'm sweating or I'm turning red or I have, again, something at the pit of my stomach, it might be your first clue that you're about to react and say something that you'll regret. Then after that, what assumptions am I making? So am I being a judger? Am I trying to feeling sorry for myself or accuse the others? Or am I in the learning mode, trying to say, what can I learn from this? Why is this happening to me, but not in terms of feeling sorry, but what lesson is it for me to learn in there? And then, as I said, trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes. So what are their triggers? What are their emotions? What are their assumptions? And then once you've gone through this, what do you do with that knowledge? So there's options. You have options to deal with this situation. And what I'm suggesting you to do is to list these options. Like, do I want to talk to the person? Do I want to ignore them? Do I want to bring it to my manager? Do I want to, just do nothing? And for each of these options that you write down, look at the pros and cons for you and also the pros and cons for the other person. And sometimes that helps us decide, is this really the best path to take to resolve the issue? So to close this, remember that your attitude, what can make the difference between damaging your relationship or deepening it. And I will now take questions.
Thank you, Isabelle. It was a great presentation. Even if we've had a few technical difficulties, it's been really taken well by the participants. We've had great feedback on the resources that you have provided and the tips that you have provided. The first question is about the triggers that you mentioned when our values, needs, and aspect of our identity are challenged. Aside from the 5 needs that you discussed, Isabelle, can you provide us with a few more examples of workplace needs, of how we can apply this at the workplace environment?
Yes, yes. So remember that needs are subjective. So we can be faced with the same situation and have different needs. So often you'll see that the needs can fall under the categories, but concrete example could be the need to perceive that I'm making a difference. So that would be the need to feel the recognition. Being stimulated intellectually, having the opportunity to learn, having the opportunity to grow. So whether it's promotions or whether it's a lateral transfer. Having a respectful work environment free of violence, that's the need for security. Having your sense of autonomy, being empowered at work. So those are all examples of workplace needs that people might have.
Thank you, Isabelle. One of the participants asked about what are the top three key resources that you would suggest in supporting positive and healthy workplaces? You have provided a list of resources, but from those, are there any specific that you would suggest that would be useful for participants around positive and healthy workplaces?
I really like the choice map. I think that's a great resource by Adam. It's quick to remind ourselves, are we judging or are we learning? So I think that would be one that's really important. And another resource is, I think it's important about the emotion piece and trying to understand what the emotions are telling us. And then we can respond to it a little more, if you want, by being aware and rationally. But it starts with the emotion. So I would say the choice map and reading on emotions and how they can tell us about how we're about to react.
And what we're putting in as part of the presentation, there's a choice map web link at the bottom on this slide so that you can see where to access the resource. A second question, Isabelle, is that you suggested that when we explore options, we assess the pros and cons of each option from both perspectives. What if by doing that we realize that there's no real pros for the other person, and we still feel that the best, what's the best option? Like, how would we go ahead with that option, like when there's no real pros?
Yeah, that's an important question because let's say you decide, okay, I want to, and I'll use you, Josette, because we know each other. Let's say I decide I need to talk to Josette about a situation that happened between us, but then I realize that for Josette, there's no real positive that can come out of this. So if I decide that I still want to talk to Josette, by knowing that on her side there's no real positive, I might want to prepare myself differently. I might want to change the message or adapt the message because I know that she probably will not be too open about me discussing this with you. Or I might look for a sign that I am triggering her, because if there's no real pro for her to discuss that, she might be really defensive or aggressive. So if I, again, look for triggers, or the way, is she turning red, is she becoming agitated, is she in her language, it's a sign that I'm triggering her. And then if you really want to talk to the person knowing there's no real positive for her, you can decide to do it slowly and incrementally. So you can say, I'm just going to tell you a little bit, we can talk slowly, and then we can meet again in a week, in a month, or just to make sure that the person has time to reflect. But knowing that there's no real pro might make you aware of how you want to approach the person.
Thank you, Isabelle. So that's really presenting a few more scenarios on how you can establish, communications and having ways to navigate through these difficult conversations. So now it's the end of the webinar, and I will ask the participant to participate in a short polling. It's two questions that we ask the participants to fill in. It really helps us really evaluate if the webinar has been valuable. We really appreciate Isabelle's expertise on this issue, and we will post the PowerPoint and have it available on YouTube. You can access this webinar and use it and share it with your colleagues. And we are putting up right now one more slide that will have Isabelle's online access, her email address. And as I mentioned, the webinar recording is in our YouTube channel. It will be posted in the next few days. And we have the certificate that you can download at the bottom of this slide. And we invite you to, if you haven't done so, to register for our biennium conference. It's in Ottawa from June 18th to June 20th. Thank you for your participation and your patience, and thanks, Isabelle, for a great presentation. Bye for now, and have a great day.